CBS Y and R Fridays. Full episodes, the 13th of March 2026. The truth has a way of surfacing in Genoa City at the worst possible moment, and when it finally does, it rarely arrives quietly. For years, the city has lived under the influence of powerful families whose conflicts shape not only businesses and alliances, but also the emotional landscape of everyone connected to them. Yet, even by those standards, the revelations surrounding Jack Abbott and his sudden disappearance sent a shockwave that rippled far beyond the walls of the restaurants and boardrooms where Genoa City's elite normally conduct their battles. What began as confusion over Jack's absence quickly turned into something far darker once the truth began to emerge. And when that truth finally reached Nikki Newman, it shattered the fragile calm she had been clinging to for days. The moment unfolded inside society, a place that usually served as neutral territory for the city's most complicated personalities. Conversations about business gossip and quiet negotiations often filled the room, but that afternoon the atmosphere was far more volatile. Diane Jenkins arrived there alongside Kyle Abbott, both of them carrying the unmistakable urgency of people who had run out of time to pretend everything was under control. Diane's determination was written clearly across her face. She was no longer willing to wait patiently while Jack remained missing and answers remained hidden behind half-truths and carefully constructed silence. For Diane, the situation had reached a breaking point. She had spent days chasing rumors, confronting possibilities she did not want to believe, and watching the people around her behave as though they knew more than they were willing to admit. The deeper she dug, the more obvious it became that the truth surrounding Jack's disappearance was not simply an unfortunate accident or a temporary misunderstanding. Something deliberate had happened. Someone powerful was responsible. And the closer Diane came to understanding what that meant, the more certain she became that the answer led directly to Victor Newman. When Diane and Kyle entered society, they were not expecting to find Nikki sitting there unaware of the storm that had been building behind the scenes. The moment Diane realized that Nikki had no idea what was happening, the entire situation shifted. For a brief second, Diane hesitated, almost as if she understood the emotional weight of the words she was about to speak, but hesitation was no longer an option. Jack's life could be in danger, and protecting someone's feelings could not take priority over protecting his freedom. Diane spoke the truth without softening it. She told Nikki that Victor was holding Jack captive and that he had attached a condition to his release. Victor wanted something in return. He wanted control over Chancellor, the powerful company that had already become the center of countless battles for influence within Genoa City. The words fell into the air like an explosion. Nikki's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Shock swept across her face, not the theatrical shock that sometimes accompanies dramatic rumors in their world, but the kind of genuine disbelief that comes when someone suddenly realizes they have been standing in the middle of a crisis without knowing it. For a moment, she simply stared at Diane as though waiting for the possibility that she had misunderstood what was being said. But the seriousness in Diane's expression made it impossible to dismiss. Instinctively, Nikki turned toward Phyllis Summers, who had been drawn into the confrontation almost against her will. Nikki demanded confirmation, her voice carrying the anger of someone who had just discovered that a devastating secret had been kept from her. The idea that something so serious could be unfolding behind closed doors while she remained unaware was not merely upsetting, it was humiliating. Phyllis tried to explain the situation carefully, choosing her words with the caution of someone who understood how dangerous the conversation had become. She admitted that Victor had indeed approached her with an offer involving Chancellor. The proposal had been complicated, tied to power and influence, the kind of negotiation Victor Newman often used to expand his control over the business world. But Phyllis insisted that Jack had never been mentioned during those discussions. According to her version of events, the deal had been strictly about corporate maneuvering. Diane refused to accept that explanation. To her, the timing was far too suspicious. Jack had vanished at the exact moment Victor began pushing for control over Chancellor. The idea that those two events were unrelated felt almost absurd. Diane accused Phyllis of deliberately stalling, of pretending not to understand the stakes, while Jack remained trapped somewhere unknown. Her voice carried the fury of a woman who believed the man she loved might be paying the price for someone else's ambition. The tension inside society grew almost unbearable. Every word exchanged between them carried years of rivalry, mistrust, and emotional history. Yet the deeper truth beneath the argument was far more frightening than their personal grievances.
If Diane was right, then Victor Newman had crossed a line even his fiercest critics might never have imagined. Holding Jack Abbott captive would not be just another ruthless business move.
It would be a declaration of war between two of the most powerful families in Genoa City. For Nikki, the weight of that possibility became impossible to ignore. She had spent decades loving Victor, defending him, and trying to understand the complex logic behind his most controversial decisions. She knew better than anyone that Victor believed the ends often justified the means. Yet even Nikki had limits to what she could accept. If Victor had truly imprisoned Jack as part of a negotiation tactic, then the situation had moved far beyond the kind of manipulation she had grown accustomed to tolerating. Nikki's patience finally broke. The frustration, anger, and disbelief swirling inside her erupted into a single decision. She announced that she was leaving immediately and returning home to confront Victor face to face. No more rumors, no more second-hand explanations, and no more secrets. She intended to demand the truth directly from the one man who could confirm it. Before Nikki could leave, Diane stopped her with a final warning that carried more emotional weight than anything else said that afternoon. Diane reminded Nikki of the complicated history between her and Jack, a history filled with moments when Jack had stood by her even when it cost him dearly. Jack had risked friendships, business alliances, and his own safety more than once because of his loyalty to Nikki. Diane urged her not to forget that now, especially if Victor's actions were placing Jack's life in danger. The reminder struck deeper than Diane may have realized. Nikki understood exactly what Diane meant. Jack had indeed sacrificed a great deal for her over the years, sometimes standing up to Victor himself in ways few people ever dared. That loyalty had created a bond between them that was difficult to explain and impossible to erase completely. The idea that Victor might now be using Jack as a bargaining chip forced Nikki to confront an emotional conflict she had hoped never to face again. As she walked out of society, Nikki carried with her the weight of a truth that could change everything. If Victor admitted that he was responsible for Jack's disappearance, their marriage could face a crisis unlike anything they had survived before. If he denied it, the mystery surrounding Jack would only grow darker. Either way, the confrontation waiting at home promised to shake the very foundation of the Newman household. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Diane's revelation were already spreading across Genoa City. Rumors travel quickly in a city where power and secrets are deeply intertwined, and the possibility that Victor Newman had taken such drastic action would ignite speculation everywhere, from corporate boardrooms to private family gatherings. The delicate balance between the Newman and Abbott families had always been fragile, but this revelation threatened to shatter it completely. For Diane and Kyle, the situation remained painfully uncertain. They had finally exposed the truth they believed was hidden, but exposing it did not guarantee Jack's safety. Somewhere beyond their reach, Jack Abbott remained missing his fate, tied to a dangerous game of power and pride, being played by people who refused to back down. And now Nikki Newman stood at the center of that game, walking toward a confrontation that might force her to choose between loyalty to her husband and the moral line she had always believed should never be crossed. In Genoa City, where alliances shift as quickly as fortunes, that choice could change everything. The fire in the hearth of the Newman Ranch living room crackled, but the warmth did nothing to chase the bone-deep chill from Nikki Newman's body. She stood rigidly by the mantel, her fingers gripping the edge of a leather-bound dossier so tightly her knuckles were white. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with a deafening rhythm, counting down the final seconds of her marriage. When the heavy oak front door swung open, the familiar, commanding footsteps of Victor Newman echoed through the hall. He walked into the living room with the air of a monarch returning to his castle, slipping out of his bespoke cashmere overcoat. "Nikki, my darling," Victor rumbled, his deep baritone laced with its usual absolute authority. "I saw your car in the drive. I thought you were spending the afternoon at the athletic club." Nikki did not turn round immediately. She closed her eyes, drawing a shaky breath, praying to whatever higher power was listening that the papers in her hand were an elaborate forgery. But she knew they weren't. She turned to face her husband of so many years, the great love of her life, and felt nothing but a hollow, echoing horror. "I received a package today," Nikki said, her voice dangerously quiet, "from a private investigator I hired when things stopped making sense." Victor's posture stiffened infinitesimally. The warmth vanished from his dark eyes, replaced by the calculating gaze of the ruthless businessman she knew too well. "Nikki, what is this about? You know, I despise it when you speak in riddles." She threw the dossier onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy, damning thud. Glossy photographs spilled out alongside transcribed audio logs and financial wire transfers. "Jack Abbott," she spat the name out, the syllables tasting like ash. "You kidnapped him, Victor. You actually orchestrated the abduction of Jack Abbott." For a long, agonizing moment, the room was perfectly silent. Nikki watched Victor's face, waiting for the shock, the denial, the outrage of a man falsely accused. Instead, Victor merely glanced at the spilled photographs, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. He didn't even blink. "Where did you get these?" Victor demanded, his voice dropping an octave, taking on that dangerous gravelly edge that made grown men tremble in the boardroom of Newman Enterprises. "Is that really your only concern?" Nikki's voice cracked a tear, finally escaping to trace a hot path down her cheek. Not a denial, not an explanation, just asterisk. "Where did I get the evidence of your felony? Asterisk." Victor took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture that only infuriated her further. "Nikki, you must understand. You don't know the full story. Jack Abbott has been a thorn in my side, a threat to this family for decades. He was maneuvering against me, against our legacy. I did what I had to do to neutralize the threat. It was a temporary measure, a warning." "A warning!" Nikki shrieked, the sheer absurdity of his justification shattering her composure. "You had a man pulled off the street, thrown into the back of a van, and held captive in an undisclosed location. That isn't a business maneuver, Victor. That is a violent crime. That is madness." "I protected our family," Victor roared back, the volume of his voice vibrating the crystal decanters on the wet bar. "Everything I do for the Newmans. Jack Abbott would have destroyed everything we built if I hadn't stepped in and reminded him of his place. He was unharmed. He was released. It was a calculated risk, and I handled it." Nikki stared at him, truly seeing the man before her. He wasn't the romantic who had wished her away, nor the protector who had held her through her darkest hours. He was a megalomaniac, entirely consumed by his own God complex. There was not a single ounce of remorse in his eyes. He stood there tall and unyielding, genuinely believing that the laws of morality and society did not apply to Victor Newman. "You feel absolutely no guilt," Nikki whispered, the realization settling over her like a heavy shroud. "You think you were right to do this." "I am Victor Newman," he stated, as if that were the only justification required by the universe. "I make the hard choices so you don't have to. You should not be concerning yourself with these matters, my sweet." "Don't you dare patronize me," Nikki hissed, her spine straightening as a new, unfamiliar resolve flooded her veins. The decades of cyclical drama, of forgiving his transgressions, of looking the other way when his ruthlessness crossed the line, it all evaporated in an instant. She was done. The well of her forgiveness had finally run completely dry. "I am not a naive girl you can manipulate anymore," Victor, Nikki said, her voice eerily calm now. "I have spent half my life defending you to the world, telling everyone that beneath that cold exterior is a good man. But there isn't. You are exactly the monster Jack Abbott always said you were. Victor's eyes narrowed dangerously. You are upset. You are speaking out of turn, Nikki. I suggest you go upstairs, calm down, and we will discuss this rationally over dinner. There will be no dinner, Nikki replied, her tone glacial. There will be no discussion. I am filing for divorce, Victor. Immediately. The words hung in the air, sharp and lethal. Victor's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. Divorce. Don't be ridiculous. We have been down this road before, Nikki. We always find our way back to each other. You are my wife. You will always be my wife. I will not permit a divorce. You don't own me and you don't permit me to do anything, Nikki countered, stepping closer to him, refusing to cower before his towering frame. This isn't a negotiation. This is the end. I am walking out of this house, and I am instructing my attorneys to draw up the papers tonight. Our marriage is over. Irrevocably. Permanently. Victor's face darkened with a terrifying rage. If you think I will let you drag the Newman name through the mud in some frivolous divorce proceeding, you are sorely mistaken. I will tie you up in court for the rest of your natural life. You will get nothing. Nikki reached down, picking up the dossier from the glass table. She tapped it gently against her palm, a bitter, triumphant smile playing on her lips. You really aren't listening, Victor. If you contest this divorce, if you so much as breathe a word of resistance to my lawyers, I will take this entire file straight to the Genoa City Police Department, and then I will hand-deliver copies to the Genoa City Chronicle, GC Buzz, and every national news syndicate in the country. Victor froze. For the first time in perhaps a decade, genuine uncertainty flickered in his dark eyes. Imagine the headlines, Nikki continued, her voice dripping with venom. Victor Newman, arrested for the kidnapping of Jack Abbott. Imagine the SEC investigation. Imagine what will happen to the board of directors at Newman Enterprises when they find out their CEO is facing 20 years in federal prison. The stock will plummet. Your legacy, the only thing you truly love, will be reduced to ashes. You wouldn't dare, Victor growled, taking a menacing step forward. You would be destroying your children's inheritance. Our children are grown and wealthy in their own right, Nikki fired back without missing a beat, and quite frankly, they deserve to know exactly who their father is. So here are my terms, Victor. You will sign whatever papers my lawyers put in front of you. You will not fight me on a single asset. You will let me go quietly, or I swear to God I will burn your empire to the ground. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating in its intensity. Victor glared at her, his mind visibly racing, calculating the angles, looking for a way out. But Nikki held the ultimate trump card, and he knew it. The great Victor Newman was cornered by his own wife. Without waiting for his response, Nikki turned on her heel and marched out of the living room, ascending the grand sweeping staircase with a purposeful stride. She walked into the master suite, the room that held 1,000 memories of passion and heartbreak, and felt absolutely nothing. She bypassed the sprawling walk-in closets filled with designer gowns, furs, and priceless jewelry. Instead, she pulled a single leather weekend bag from the top shelf. Nikki packed only the barest essentials, a few changes of comfortable clothes, her toiletries, her passport, and the framed photograph of her children that sat on her nightstand. She left the diamond necklaces in their velvet boxes. She left the extravagant gifts Victor had showered upon her over the years. They felt tainted now, bought with blood money and intimidation. Taking them would be a tether to a life she was violently severing. Zipping the bag shut, she slung it over her shoulder. The physical weight was nothing compared to the immense psychological relief that was beginning to blossom in her chest. When she descended the stairs, Victor was standing in the foyer, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked older in the dimming afternoon light, the shadows accentuating the deep lines on his face. "Nikki," he said, his voice softer, now attempting a different tactic. "Please think about what you are throwing away." "I know exactly what I'm throwing away," Nikki said, her hand resting on the brass handle of the front door. "A lie. Goodbye, Victor." She opened the door and walked out into the crisp Wisconsin air. She didn't look back as she climbed into the driver's seat of her car, started the engine, and drove down the long, winding driveway of the Newman Ranch for the very last time. The wrought iron gates closed behind her with a definitive metallic clang that echoed in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, Nikki had arrived at her sanctuary. It was a secluded private villa nestled on the edge of Lake Geneva, a property she had purchased years ago under a blind trust, primarily as an investment. Victor had never been here. It didn't bear his scent, his aesthetic, or his overbearing presence. It was entirely her own. The villa was modern and minimalist, surrounded by towering pines that shielded it from the prying eyes of the world. As she walked through the front door, the profound silence of the house wrapped around her like a protective blanket. There were no maids rushing to take her coat, no security guards patrolling the perimeter, no ringing phones demanding her attention, just peace. Nikki set her bag down on the hardwood floor and walked into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, gripping the cold glass as she stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the moonlit waters of the lake. She had done it. She had finally broken the cycle. The trauma of the day threatened to overwhelm her, but she focused on her breathing, repeating a silent mantra of strength. She took her smartphone from her purse, powered it off entirely, and dropped it into a drawer. She wanted no contact with the outside world. She needed this quiet space to mourn the death of her marriage and to rebuild the shattered pieces of her soul. Back in Genoa City, Victor Newman was a man descending into a frantic, chaotic desperation. The sprawling ranch felt cavernous and empty without Nikki's presence. He paced the length of his study, pouring his third glass of scotch, his mind warring between fury and a terrifying sense of loss. Victor was a man who solved problems, a man who conquered enemies, but he could not conquer the empty space on the other side of his bed. Over the next 3 days, Victor launched a relentless campaign to win her back, convinced that her departure was merely a dramatic flare-up that could be smoothed over with enough persistence and capital. He dispatched his elite security team to track her down, easily locating the Lake Geneva villa despite her attempts at privacy. Once he knew where she was, the barrage began. On Tuesday morning, a fleet of delivery vans arrived at the villa's security gate, carrying hundreds of arrangements of Nikki's favorite white orchids. On Wednesday, a private courier arrived, bearing a velvet box containing a 10-carat diamond necklace and a handwritten letter from Victor pleading for a meeting. On Thursday, Victor himself arrived in his chauffeured limousine, demanding the private security guards Nikki had hired open the gates. But Nikki was immovable. She sat on the terrace of the villa, sipping her morning tea, watching impassively as her guards turned the florists away. She instructed the courier to return the diamonds to sender unopened. And when Victor stood at the gates shouting her name into the intercom, she simply reached over and disconnected the power to the speaker system. Every attempt at reconciliation was met with a wall of absolute impenetrable ice. Victor's gifts were rejected, his calls went straight to a disconnected voicemail, and his demands were ignored. The great Victor Newman was rendered entirely powerless by a woman who simply refused to engage. As the week drew to a close, the pressure cooker of secrets in Genoa City finally exploded. Nikki had promised not to leak the evidence if Victor cooperated with the divorce, but the universe had other plans. Perhaps it was a rogue private investigator looking for a bigger payday, or perhaps Jack Abbott himself had finally gathered enough circumstantial evidence to go to the authorities. Whatever the source, the dam broke on a Friday morning. The notification ripped through the digital sphere of Genoa City like a shockwave. It started as a breaking news alert from the Genoa City Chronicle, instantly picked up by GC Buzz, and then violently propelled into the national spotlight by major financial news networks. The headline was a devastating, comprehensive deep dive. It detailed the timeline of Jack's disappearance, the witness accounts of the unmarked van, and most damningly, a leaked paper trail of offshore wire transfers from a Newman Enterprises shell company to the mercenaries who had executed the kidnapping. It painted a picture of a corporate tyrant who operated above the law, using cartel tactics to eliminate business competitors. In her secluded villa, Nikki turned on the television for the first time in days. She stood motionless in the center of the living room, watching the news anchors dissect the scandal with breathless excitement. Footage of the Newman Ranch being swarmed by news vans played on a loop juxtaposed with file footage of a battered but defiant Jack Abbott giving a press conference outside Jabbot Cosmetics, vowing that justice would be served. Nikki felt a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. She had tried to warn him. She had tried to make him see the destructive path he was on. Now the world was seeing the Victor Newman she had confronted in their living room just days prior. Miles away, in the towering glass and steel monolith of Newman Enterprises, Victor stood in his executive office. The panoramic view of Genoa City spread out beneath him, a kingdom he had ruled with an iron fist for decades. But today the kingdom was in full revolt. His office doors were locked. The phones on his desk were lighting up like a Christmas tree, calls from panicked board members, furious shareholders, and his high-priced legal team. On the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall, the financial news was playing out a nightmare scenario. The ticker at the bottom of the screen flashed a brilliant violet red. Newman Enterprises stock was in a freefall. The market was reacting to the scandal with utter panic. Investors were dumping their shares by the millions, terrified of the impending SEC investigations and the very real possibility that the CEO of the company was about to be indicted for a major felony. Victor stared at the plummeting numbers, his hands gripping the edge of his mahogany desk so hard the wood groaned in protest. His legacy, the empire he had built from nothing, was bleeding out before his eyes. He looked away from the television, his gaze falling upon a silver-framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of him and Nikki taken years ago at a charity gala. She was smiling, radiant, looking at him with a love that he had always assumed was unconditional and unbreakable. Now the frame felt like a tombstone. Victor Newman, the undefeated champion of Genoa City, stood entirely alone in his glass tower. He had sacrificed his morality to destroy Jack Abbott, and in the process he had destroyed his marriage, fractured his family, and set his own empire on fire. As the sirens of approaching police squad cars began to wail in the distance, echoing up from the city streets below, Victor finally realized the true cost of his hubris. He had won the battle, but he had lost everything that actually mattered. And for the first time in his life, there was no one left to save him.